Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I'm Gary Machuda, and we're continuing our series on the cessation of prophecy theory. In the first video, we showed how the cessation of prophecy theory, although it's propounded as a self-evident, well-defined belief, actually could fit in all sorts of different beliefs under the umbrella term, so it's very ambiguous. And so in the last video, we looked at proto-canonical evidence, both for and against. Or rather, I should say we looked for evidence for and against the cessation of prophecy theory. I think you agree with me that the second video is very underwhelming in terms of any kind of indication in Scripture that a cessation of prophecy occurred at the time of Malachi, lasted for 400 years, and then it reappeared again with the Christian era. It's really not there. There are some ambiguous passages that may speak in a general sense that God may stop speaking for his people, or instruction will be very hard to find in certain days, but it doesn't really tell us what or how long or whether it's permanent or to what extent. There are a few definite passages in the Proto-Canon that speak of a loss of prophecy during the Babylonian captivity. And so that shows something. There are a few passages that speak of the cessation of false prophecy, which of course has nothing really to do with the cessation of prophecy theory. And that's about it. We also looked at one text in Daniel, which possibly could speak against the cessation of prophecy. At least it proposes the cessation occurred not 400 years before Christ, but actually during the Messianic era. I would say specifically with John the Baptist. Now, that last point, like I said, it is weak because it really depends on how you understand and interpret Daniel. So in this video, what I want to do is look at deuterocanonical evidence. Now, surprisingly, it's really here that we start getting some very firm indications about whether or not there was a cessation of prophecy. So strap in, folks, because we're going to be looking at deuterocanonical evidence both for and against the cessation of prophecy, and I guarantee you there's going to be some surprises. One standard feature of presentations about the cessation of prophecy is often that the Deuterocanon itself supports the idea that prophecy ceased long before the time of Christ, which is a bit surprising because the Deuterocanon, as you know, are considered scripture by Catholic and Orthodox. They're rejected by Protestants and Jews as Apocrypha. But does the Deuterocanon really support this idea that all prophets and prophecy ceased at the time of Malachi and remained silent for 400 years until it reappears with the Christian era? Well, let's find out. Now, our first text, it comes from the Theodosian translation of the book of Daniel. So this will not be found in Protestant Bibles. They will be found in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles. And so we're looking at Daniel 3:38, according to the Theodosian translation, which reads, quote, "We have in our day no prince, prophet, or leader, no holocaust, sacrifice, oblation, or incense, no place to offer first fruits, to find favor with you," unquote. Now, the context of this is the Song of the Three Children in the Furnace, which is found in the proto-canonical version of Daniel as well. So it's during the Babylonian captivity. The three youths are singing this praise of God, and they're bewailing the fact that at their time there was no, quote, prince, prophet, or leader. Does this teach a cessation of 400 years of prophets and prophecy? Well, no, because, like I said, the three youths are found in the proto-canonical book of Daniel, which occurs during the Babylonian captivity. So actually, this text from Theodosian fits very well with what we saw in Psalm 74:9 and also Lamentations 2:9, namely that part of God's punishment during the Babylonian captivity was that he didn't speak to his people. Now, in the last video, we saw that this cessation of prophecy during the exile was only temporary. Because after all, you have the prophet Daniel, you have Ezekiel, you have the post-exilic prophets as well. So this was only a temporary punishment, one that's noted in proto-canonical books, and it's also noted here in the Theodosian version of Daniel 3:38. An even more popular text that's cited in favor of the cessation of prophecy. Actually, there's two, and they both come from the Deuterocanonical book of First Maccabees. And so what I'd like to do is group them together because they're very similar, and the points made from these texts are very similar as well. The first one comes from First Maccabees 4:45-46, which reads, quote, "And they thought it best to tear it down, lest it bring reproach upon them, for the Gentiles had defiled it. So they tore down the altar, and they stored the stones in the convenient place on the temple hill until there should come a prophet to tell them what to do with them." Likewise, in 1 Maccabees 14:41, it says, quote, "And the Jews and their priests decided that Simon should be their leader and high priest forever until a trustworthy prophet should arise," unquote. Now, both these texts are usually adduced by those who want to support the cessation of prophecy theory as evidence that prophets and prophecy was not active during the Maccabean period. In fact, some Protestant apologists go so far as to use this to disqualify the book of Maccabees, because they say, look, if there weren't prophets during the time of Maccabees, then obviously there couldn't have been a prophet to write the book of Maccabees, so it must be a secular writing. But that's actually a little beyond our purpose here. Do these two texts support this idea that prophets and prophecy ceased at Malachi and extended 400 years down to the time of Christ? Well, I think even if you concede that the theory is true, I think looking at these texts, you realize that it sort of falls short. I mean, it would fit with the theory in that these two texts speak about a time where in their day, there wasn't a prophet they could consult. So it would fit in with the theory, but it doesn't say anything about the whole cessation of prophecy per se. In other words, there's no indication that it's been standing for a couple hundred years before the Maccabees. There's no indication that there's no hope that a prophet will arise in the future. In fact, it proves just the opposite. And this is kind of interesting because as you read these texts, you can see that their expectation that's predicated on the arrival of a prophet. Now, if the cessation of prophecy is true, and no prophets have appeared since the time of Malachi, and there's no expectation that there will be a prophet coming around soon to tell them what to do with these things, then it seems to me that that anticipation speaks against the cessation of prophecy theory. In other words, they were expecting, perhaps sometime soon, a prophet to come along and direct them what to do. So these are actually great proof texts as counter evidence to the cessation of prophecy. Now, I'd like to quote from an article that's found in the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, edited by Gerhard Kittel, because it concludes the same thing that I just said. So this isn't my Catholic bias being read into the text. This is something that Protestant scholarship has acknowledged for quite some time. It says, quote, "On the restoration of the temple by Judas Maccabeus, the stones of the desecrated altar were set aside to be used only when a prophet arose to make the necessary intimation. This is usually regarded as a sign that there was no current prophecy, but this understanding is not quite correct. Exposition should rather assume that the author regards the present appearance of a prophet as possible. 2 Maccabees 10:1 and following does not carry the prophecy motif. In terms of their basic religious attitude, 1 Maccabees agrees with Sirach and his grandson. It need be no surprise that such views were possible at a time when neo-prophecy was already emerging pseudepigraphically, for the differing outlooks did not cancel one another out, but existed together for a long time. The rabbinical theory that there was no present prophecy, as we shall see later, did not prevail until the post-apostolic period, unquote. In other words, yes, it may show that currently at that time a prophet wasn't available, but there's a clear expectation that a prophet would arise, which would be incompatible with 400 years of silence. Another text from 1 Maccabees is 1 Maccabees 9:27, which reads as follows, quote, "Thus there was great distress in Israel, such as not been seen since the time that prophets ceased to appear among them," unquote. So this text is almost always adduced as positive evidence for the cessation of prophecy, that there was a period where God ceased to speak to Israel, and that period lasted all the way down to the time of Maccabees. So usually all three of the first Maccabee quotes are put together to kind of complete that picture. But here's the problem. Maccabees equates the present distress to when the prophets ceased to appear in Israel. But when was that? Was this the 400 years of continuous silence? When did it start? When did it end? Was it absolute? Was it sporadic? Was it, what are the parameters here? What is being talked about? Well, I think a really good source to understand how this text should be understood comes from none other than Flavius Josephus himself. Now, in previous videos, we looked at Josephus and the 22-book canon. We actually did 3 videos on this. And by the way, Josephus is, I think, of all the evidence for the cessation of prophecy theory, his certainly ranks among the top in terms of the strongest and clearest supposed affirmation of this theory. Ironically, though, even though Josephus is this prime real estate in terms of establishing the cessation of prophecy, he did not look at 1 Maccabees 9 as a proof text for such a thing. In fact, we have him give a summary of this passage from 1 Maccabees in his work Antiquities of the Jews, in which he paraphrases it as the following, quote, "And when this calamity of the Jews had become so great, as they had never had experience of the like since their return out of Babylon," unquote. Now, let's put those two texts together. 1 Maccabees says, "Thus there was great distress in Israel, such as had not been since the time the prophets ceased to appear among them." Josephus says, "When this calamity of the Jews had become so great, as they had never had experience of the like since their return out of Babylon." The time that the prophets ceased occurred during the Babylonian captivity. And this should be no surprise, because this is exactly what we found in other texts, such as Psalm 74, verse 9, which says, quote, "Now we see no signs, we have no prophets, no one knows how long." And Lamentations 8:9 says, quote, "Sunk into the ground are her gates, he has removed and broken her bars. Her king and her princes are among the pagans. Priestly instruction is wanting, and her prophets did not receive any vision from the Lord," unquote. And in fact, we just read with Theodosian Daniel 3:38, quote, "We have in our day no prince, prophet, or leader." So it's already well established that there was a cessation of prophets and prophecy during the Babylonian captivity. Josephus believes that 1 Maccabees 9 is referring to that period. And of course, we've already established that that period of cessation in Babylon could only be a temporary cessation. And if that's true, then that means that 1 Maccabees 9 is not referring to 400 years of silence, but it's merely hearkening the present distress to that period of judgment back in Babylon. Speaking of counter evidence, let's go to texts that show that the cessation of prophecy, that there was a 400-year span of silence, simply didn't take place. Now remember, the Deuterocanon was written during the center of this supposed period of silence. For example, the book of Sirach was written about 200 BC, all the way through to 2nd Maccabees, which covers around 140 BC. So is there any evidence that there were prophets and visions and inspired texts being written during this period? Well, yes, there is. In fact, since we were talking about Maccabees, why don't we continue in the same vein with 2 Maccabees 15:11. When he had armed each of them, not so much with the safety of shield and spear as with encouragement of noble words, he cheered them all by relating a dream, a kind of vision worthy of belief. Here, Judas Maccabees is relating a dream that he received, which he styles as a waking vision, that is said to be worthy of belief. Now, what he then gives is a predictive prophecy about the divine assistance that God is going to give his army in conquering the Greeks that are about to invade Jerusalem. And it comes true. How in the world could Judas Maccabee believe that he receives a vision from God when, in fact, visions and prophecies and prophetic dreams and all that sort of stuff stopped way back in the time of Malachi? Now, regardless of whether you believe this is an authentic vision, let's put that aside and let's look at the narrative and what it assumes. It assumes that Judas Maccabeus and his entire army believed this vision to be true. Notice no one piped up and said, that can't be true, Judas, because prophetic dreams and visions doesn't exist since the time of Malachi. Well, apparently they didn't get the memo. Okay, let's move on from the last Deuterocanonical book to the earliest Deuterocanonical book. And here we have a couple of texts that also speak against the cessation of prophecy theory, starting with the book of Sirach, chapter 24, verses 29 through 31. Now, some Bibles have different versifications, so your Bible might have this as chapter 24, verses 31 through 33. And it reads as follows, quote, "Now I, like a rivulet from her stream, channeling the waters into a garden, said to myself, I will water my plants, my flower bed I will drench. And suddenly this rivulet of mine became a river, then this stream of mine a sea. Thus do I send my teachings forth, shining like the dawn, to become known afar off. Thus do I pour out instruction like prophecy, and bestow it on generations to come." Unquote. So here we have Sirach describing his own work, and he says that it is like a channel that diverts this wisdom that flows from the law of Moses. If you read the preceding context, you can see that it overflows, it reveals wisdom, understanding, knowledge, and that river that starts becomes a massive sea that shines forth to all people like dawn, and it also is intended for future generations to come. So there's a few points I want to make here. First, when Sirach's describing his own work, he describes it as if he dug a channel that takes the waters of wisdom that flows from the laws of Moses, that reveals wisdom and understanding and knowledge, and overflows the banks like rivers. His writing is actually a channel from that very same divine wisdom. Second thing to note also is that he says that like the wisdom found in the law that is like a sea that is so deep no one could find its bottom, that his teachings too become a sea with the same kind of depth. But probably the most important part is that he says that he's pouring forth instruction like prophecy. Well, that would be odd because prophecy, according to the cessation theory, stopped hundreds of years earlier. Now, somebody might discount this and say, well, he doesn't say he's pouring forth instruction as prophecy. He says it's like prophecy. But that, I think, misses the point, because what exactly is his instruction, since it has the same characteristics as these prophetic streams that flow from the law of Moses? In fact, what's very interesting is that Sirach believes that his writing would be for all people, since it shines forth like the dawn during the day and everybody can see it, but even more importantly, that it is for generations to come. If this is not some sort of inspired work, why would he have this expectation? Such shouldn't take place if there had been a couple of hundred years already of no prophets and divine silence. Another text from Sirach can be found in chapter 33, verses 16 through 18, which reads as follows, quote, "Now I am the last to keep vigil, like a gleaner after the vintage, since by the Lord's blessing I have made progress till, like a vintager, I have filled my winepress. I would inform you that not only for myself have I toiled, but for every seeker after wisdom," unquote. Notice that Sirach here likens himself to someone who was allowed to enter a vineyard after the vintagers had picked their fruit, namely Solomon and the prophets. Now, as a gleaner after the vintagers, he too picks the fruit of wisdom from the same divine vines, and by the Lord's blessing, even though he's a gleaner, he's able to accomplish the same thing that the vintagers did, namely that he was able to fill his wine press with the grapes that he picked, just as if he had been one of the grape pickers himself. Again, according to the cessation of prophecy theory, once the vintagers are done, once Malachi picks that last grape of wisdom, the vineyard is closed because there's just no more grapes on the vine to be picked until Elijah comes and the new covenant comes, and then new grapes would arise, to use the same analogy. Well, obviously, this is not the viewpoint of Sirach. Sirach believes there are still plenty of grapes, and because God has mysteriously blessed him with progress, he was able to accomplish the same thing that the original vintagers had done and fill his wine press with this divine wisdom. Again, that certainly speaks against the idea of a cessation of prophecy. Sticking with Sirach, let's move all the way to the beginning to the Greek preface that is attached to Sirach. This preface was written by Sirach's grandson, in which he recommends his translation to the readers. And in it, he says something very interesting. "Such a one was my grandfather Jesus, who, having devoted himself for a long time to the diligent study of the law, the prophets, and the rest of the books of our ancestors, and having developed a thorough familiarity with them, was moved to write something himself in the nature of instruction and wisdom, in order that those who love wisdom might, by acquainting themselves with what he too had written, make even greater progress in living in conformity with the divine law," unquote. Notice there's a couple of things here that doesn't fit with the cessation of prophecy theory. First, he says that his grandfather was moved to write something also pertaining to wisdom and instruction. But how could he be moved to write something like this when inspiration supposedly had ceased with Malachi? In fact, what he was moved to write was in the nature of instruction and wisdom. And this is important because at the very beginning of the preface, Sirach's grandson says, quote, "Many important truths have been handed down to us through the law, the prophets, and the later authors. And for these, the instruction and wisdom of Israel merit praise." Notice here that he says that the law, the prophets, and the writings give instruction and wisdom to Israel, and for that Israel is worthy of praise. What does the law, prophets, and writing give? Instruction and wisdom. What was Sirach moved to write about? In the nature of instruction and wisdom, the same thing. Now, what's even more intriguing is if you look at it, it's the stated purpose of the book of Proverbs, a book attributed to Solomon, where it says that the purpose is, quote, "the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction." The same two Greek words. The purpose of Proverbs is to give instruction and wisdom. Notice that the Greek preface assumes that the Jews who are reading the preface would agree with them, that they wouldn't raise any difficulty about someone writing instruction and wisdom after Malachi, especially being moved to do so. So the book of Sirach offers a number of important points in terms of counter evidence to the cessation of prophecy theory. We have one more text, though, that I think is pretty definitive on this, and that is the book of wisdom, the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7, verse 27, which says, quote, "And passing in the holy souls from age to age, she," that's divine wisdom, "produces friends of God and prophets," unquote. What does God's divine wisdom do? It produces friends of God and prophets. When? From age to age. In other words, wisdom is teaching that there are friends of God and prophets in every age. This is a direct contradiction to the cessation of prophecy theory, which says that not every age. In fact, there's 400 years where not a single prophet has appeared in Israel. Well, apparently, the author of the Book of Wisdom didn't get that memo. And in fact, he believes that the reader of his book would also accept the same thing as possible. So at the very least, I think Wisdom 727 is a defeater to the idea that the cessation of prophecy was universally held by all Jews prior to Christ. Obviously, it wasn't. Wisdom shows every age produced prophets. Sirach believed that he was giving divine wisdom. He was pouring it out like prophecy, which would be a really odd analogy if prophecy was no longer even possible. Sirach's grandson in his preface believed that his grandfather was moved to write something in terms of wisdom and instruction. And then, of course, we have the vision where Judas Maccabeus, God had shown him through Jeremiah and the high priest that he's going to win this incredible victory over his enemies. And of course, we also have the writings from First Maccabees, which anticipated the arrival of a prophet and also spoke about a time in the past where a temporary cessation happened in Babylon. So the Deuterocanonical evidence, I think, is overwhelmingly against any kind of idea of a cessation of prophecy. It shows no understanding of 400 years of silence, even though these books were written in the midst of this supposed silent period. So we're going to move on in our next video. We're going to look at New Testament evidence, both for and against the cessation of prophecy theory. And I think hopefully as we're going through this evidence, you'll be able to see exactly how well-founded this theory is and make your own conclusions. So thank you so much for watching, and God willing, I'll be able to produce yet another video in this series. Bye-bye, everyone.